In this video, I will show you how I start with a stencil and fabric paints to create a hand-painted look on fabrics. The best fabrics or garments for this project will be 100% or at least 95% cotton content, pre-washed with no fabric softener. For a heavier fabric like this denim, I spritz it first with just a fine mist of water. That way the goal is to have that paint penetrate into the fibers. You can see I'm using the stencil and my stencil brush with very little paint. I'm trying to get really just the shading down and some outlining, really not focusing on making anything solid. I will come back in later with some hand painting with a fine paintbrush. With every stencil, there are spaces where there are bridges applied. These connect all the little pieces together so that the whole stencil doesn't fall apart, and it makes these gaps in the stencil. So as I am brushing over softly, just filling in, making some shading, I'm trying to avoid getting solid or dark paint in the areas where those bridges are. That's going to help me later create a more natural hand-painted look. For your convenience, the supplies I used in this project will be listed in the description. I don't have a lot of paint on my brush, and I'm trying to swirl it around and move the brush in the direction of the feathers or how the natural flow of the object would be. So I am moving in and out from the feathers. I'm concentrating, making the areas that I want to have outlined a bit darker. Now I'm taking a liner brush and I'm filling in those bridges that are caused naturally from the stencil. You'll notice I'm also, with very little paint on my brush, swiping in a little bit more shadowing where I think it needs to be. I like to look at real hummingbirds before I start a project like this. And in fact, with this project, I looked up my local hummingbirds just to get an idea for my coloring or painting choices. If you're working with denim, you might need to spritz your paint with a little water now and then if it begins to drag on your fabric. There is a balance of not enough water and too much water that it will bleed the paint. So if you're new to this, you might want to just try on a sample or just go for it and hope it turns out the way I do. One of the beauties of working on a piece of separate fabric that you can attach or applique to your garment. That way if you mess up, it's just a piece of fabric and you can start again. If you do paint directly on your garment and you find you're not happy with it, you can always use this method of painting or stenciling on a smaller piece and applique it over your mistake. You'll see my goal is not to have solid stenciled lines, but have shadowing and outlining so that I have plenty of negative space or unpainted areas of the fabric that I can bring in color. I usually add a small dot of white to the center of the eye. Let your stenciling dry and then heat set it on high cotton setting until it's super hot. Then you can go on to the next layer. After I clean my stencil and my stencil brushes, I wrap an elastic around my stencil brush and push it to the top bristles to keep those tight and firm as they're drying out, ready for my next stenciling project. Okay, now that I've heat set, I can add some fun colors without worrying about it bleeding so much. Actually, this stencil paint I've used is almost like a resist, and it will help this Batik paint that I'm using from bleeding outside the stencil perimeters. I'm painting colors that work well together. I keep on painting, but if I paint colors that are opposite on the color wheel, they might bleed together and form a muddy look, so I heat set in between each of those layers. Now I'm grabbing a white fabric paint. This happens to be acrylic, and I'm mixing in the medium that comes with the Batik set. But again, you can always just use fabric textile medium or a direct fabric paint that needs no medium. Usually I wait for the end of my project to add in some white highlights, but I decided to do it at this point so that the white paint can act as a resist to the watery Batik paint. After heat setting that fuchsia color, now I'm working with some yellows, some greens, and some blues, which all play very nicely together. I know they won't be making mud, so I'm not too worried about heat setting in between. These batiks are very watery, so if you ever feel they're spreading too quickly, you can always use a shop cloth, microfiber towel, paper towel, and dab it to soak up some of the paint, and then get out your heat gun or your iron and heat set in between layers to stop that flow of paint. If you're painting an area that you want to look more like a watercolor, you can always use a fine mist of water. But then again, have your shop towel or paper towel ready to sop it up if it's bleeding out too much or spreading, and then you can hit it with some heat or an iron to stop the flow of paint. Flipping this over, I see all of that Batik paint has penetrated through the fibers, which I know makes it even more permanent. Now I've heat set, and I'm going to be adding some decorative stitching with just some very basic embroidery. This stencil is just one in a series I will be offering you on my website, fruitfullifestudio.com. Again, I will list all the supplies I used for this project in the description, as well as a link to the new video series I have where I create a hand-painted, one-of-a-kind vest. Please reach out with any questions, and happy creating!